The end of the world is just beginning. The rise of globalization has given much to our world. We have been able to feed billions of people and lift millions out of poverty. We've been able to try new foods from countries across continents and oceans. We've been able to buy anything we could ever want at the click of a button and have it delivered within hours or days. But the system is vulnerable and it's on the brink of collapse. Sounds uplifting, doesn't it? Hey there, welcome back to another episode of The Brief. I'm Brittany Brander, and with my co-host Scott Crockett, we explore the big challenges that Albertans face, but also the big solutions that Albertans create. On this episode, we are joined by author and renowned geopolitical strategist Peter Zeihan, the author of The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization. Peter takes us on a journey through the rise of globalization, why America is at the heart and soul of this system, and why it's on the brink of collapse. We also discuss how demographics are changing around the world, how the de-evolution of globalization will affect regions around the world, including Alberta, and how Alberta can win in this new potential world. If you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and give us a quick review and rating. Now, on to our show.
Peter, thanks so much for joining us today. At this stage, I think it's fair to say that you're probably one of the most sought-after geopolitics speakers on the planet.
I like this.
But I actually don't want to start there. I want to start with you. And I'd love it if you can just tell our listeners a bit about yourself and how you came to this work and why you do what you do.
Oh, totally accidentally. So at my old job, I was the only generalist analyst. And so it was my job to kind of knit everything together. And as a result, I kind of became the unofficial face of the company because all the other I don't know if you do this, but most analysts are assholes because they try to make everything about the topic that they know about, even especially if it's not. And if the client knows something about that region or topic, holy crap, all hell breaks loose. And so they kind of gravitated to me because I was the only person who considered disagreement with a client as an opportunity to learn as opposed to an opportunity to pick a fight. And then when I left, discovered that a lot of the clients were willing to follow me, which was not the plan. I didn't plan on leaving. It was messy situation. Anyway, so every time I speak with a client, I have to learn the world from their point of view. And you do that a few hundred times, and all of a sudden you've got a pretty good map of how everything fits together. And so I've got a staff that helps me keep up on all current events and who helps me decipher the connections between the client's world and everything else, and that's how we do what we do.
Well, that's great. So let's dive into that work. Your latest book, which I devoured, is called The End of the World is Just the Beginning. And, in my words, I'd say it's built around this thesis that the global order that we've been used to since roughly World War II, underpinned by United States securing global shipping, is about to break down into a world of multipolarity and friend groups. Tell me about that
so
thesis.
Canadian, friend groups.
Friend shoring, yes, yeah. Canadians, we put the positive spin on nearly everything. Tell me about that thesis and how you came to it and how sure are you that it's going to play out? How sure are you that the world as we know it is about to break apart?
Oh, I'm pretty sure. So it's a twin story of demographics and geography. So in the world before 1945, if you had iron ore and coal and oil and food, you could industrialize and make something of yourself. And if you failed to have all four of those things, then you were probably a colony because they would be industrialized, you would not, and they would be bringing guns to knife fights. And that is the entirety of the story of the British Empire. In 1945, things changed because the Americans found themselves in a world they didn't recognize. We were in Europe at the end of the war, and we saw Stalinist Russia. And we didn't like it. We're like, holy crap, we do not want to go up against that by ourselves. So we needed bodies, lots and lots of bodies to stand up and stand between us and the Soviets. No one wanted to do that because World War II sucked for everybody in Europe. So we basically had to come up with an inducement. And the solution was free trade and globalization.
Access to the American market.
Access to the American market, access to global resources. Because it used to be that if you were industrialized and you had a navy, then you could control the flow to this or that mineral or energy source or food source. And if you didn't, you were probably a pre-industrialized subsistence agriculture environment. And that was no fun at all. But now everyone didn't need those four things. They only needed one of them. and they could trade for the rest. And so we all started to develop, and that meant we all started to move into cities. And when you move into cities, kids go from being a free resource and free labor to a really, really expensive conversation piece. And we had fewer of them. And so the population structure started to age in a way it hadn't before. So if you think of a pre-industrial population like a pyramid, lots of children at the bottom, few retirees at the top, it started to open up into a chimney. Child mortality wasn't as bad. People would live longer. And we had this nice period in the advanced world from roughly 1950 to roughly 2000, when instead of having a pyramid, we had a column. Not too many children relative to the total, not too many retirees relative to the total, but a lot of people in their 20s and 30s and 40s who would consume, 40s, 50s, and 60s who would produce. And it was the fastest economic growth the world has ever seen. In 1990, globalization was kind of thrown open to everybody, and everyone else joined in, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Russians, and everything. And they went down that path a lot faster than we had. And so the transformation that we did in 2 or 3 generations, they did in 1 and 2. Well, we're now on the other side of that. After decades of rapid aging, we're not just running out of children. That was 20 to 40 years ago. We're now running out of working age adults. At the same time that the Americans, 30 years on from the Cold War, have really lost interest in maintaining the global system. So we're losing the strategic rationale for globalization. At the same time, the economic rationale is dissolving, because if you don't have enough young people to consume, there's no point in trading in the first place. So this was always the decade where it was all going to break down. It was just a question of the specifics of the order and just how fast it could happen. And what we're seeing with the degradation of the Chinese system in the Ukraine war is it can happen pretty fast.
So, you've touched on a couple of the things that I think are also, central to your work. I started by saying it's geopolitics, but it's geopolitics plus geography plus demographics.
Right.
And I want to touch on the demographics because you've brought that up. You've said that a lot of the major powers that we're used to in the world today are in terminal demographic decline. So who are the winners and losers of the demographic game going to be?
Sure. So everybody started the industrialization process at their own pace and at their own time and from different starting points. And as a rule, if you have a lot more elbow room, a lot more small towns and arable farmland, the transition was slower because the economic need to move from the urban or into the urban environments the pressure wasn't as great. And so in places with a lot of space where the weather is broadly positive, like the United States, that process has been really slow. In fact, while industrialization really got going after 1945, technically the U.S. started the process back in the 18th century. So for us, this has been a 7-8 generation process, and it's been relatively gentle. But the Germans became majority urbanized as early as 1900. And then in the post-World War II environment, when they could import food so they didn't have to eat their own crappy food, everyone moved into the cities. And it's by far the most urban environment outside of places like Singapore. So there it's much faster. The Chinese didn't start really until the 70s.
Right.
And so you've got the least productive farmland in the world with the most input intensive, with rice farming, which gives you the highest rate of fatalities just from the process of doing it. Everyone got out of the rice paddies as soon as they could. And now they all live in high rises. And so there they went from having 6 and 7 kids to less than 1 in a single generation. So the top of the list in terms of losers is by far China. We now know that the Chinese demographic situation is so poor that maintaining a national constitution is not possible past this decade. And so we're looking at a complete disintegration of that system in the short period. Korea is probably number 2, very, very rapidly aging. Started in the 50s, but so fast. Germany and Italy are probably 3 and 4 for similar reasons. But on the other side, you've got countries like the United States who've got a lot of elbow room, who have managed to keep their birth rates high. Sweden is on that list. France is on that list. Argentina is on that list. And then there's some countries in the middle where the urbanization is quick, but it's happened so relatively recently that it just hasn't had a chance to really dig in, and it might even be reversible. And that's your Indias, your Indonesias, your Mexicos, and your Brazils.
Right. Well, I want to pull apart a few of those in a later question. But first, I want to ask you to just, we're sitting here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, to zoom in a little bit on your outlook for Canada generally and Alberta specifically, because, I've heard you say some interesting things that we may be actually a very well-positioned place, even in this very scary world to come.
Yeah, key thing to remember is that there is no Canada. Canada is not a real place. It's not a real country. It is 10 provinces that have their own sets of rules and their own trade relationships, each one of which trades more with the United States than they do with the rest of Canada. I don't mean that to say that that is a bug. That is a feature because it makes the provinces a lot more dynamic and functional when there are changes in environment. So, number one, don't think about what is good for Canada. Think about what is good or bad for Ontario or Quebec or BC or Alberta. There is no unit. You guys didn't even get an internal free trade agreement until 2-3 years ago. So,
and internal barriers to trade are still a big issue. But yeah,
huge.
Well, we believe in a united Canada. I totally get what you're saying, and it's actually so refreshing to have someone come from outside Canada who actually has a level, really good knowledge of.
Who knows what your capital is?
Yeah, absolutely, and the regional differences and that sort of thing. So, okay, so. You can't look at Canada as a unit.
Right.
Let's zoom in on Alberta. What's the future look like for Alberta?
So the future we're moving into is one where we're going to lose a significant amount of energy production out of the Russian space and out of the Persian Gulf. So in that environment, anyone who is a stable energy provider can kind of write their own check. Alberta is, with Texas, at the very top of the list in terms of regional systems that are going to do very well. That's number one. Number two, we're seeing a breakdown in the trade system that allows global fertilizer to be produced. In North America, that does not apply. North America makes all of its own nitrogen fertilizer. Saskatchewan produces almost all of our potash fertilizer, and we can get phosphate from some places within North America, but certainly within the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
So in a world where global food production gets hit hard, North American producers are fine. And the crop that is going to see the most dynamic change in pricing is wheat, because wheat is only grown in places where nothing else will grow.
Because it'll grow almost anywhere comparatively, yeah.
But we've pushed it to the margin, so it will only grow in places where only wheat can grow with industrial inputs. So if you break down the industrial inputs, most wheat production around the world is going to fail, or it will have to be relocated to better land. That does not apply to North America. So if you want to talk about the crop that is going to see just explosive increases in prices, that's wheat, and that's a story for North Dakota and for Kansas and for the prairies.
Right.
So to be kind of at this nexus and to be the most capital-rich city in Canada, these are good things. So if Alberta does nothing different at all, you're going to be one of the fastest growing parts of the world for the next 30 years. Everything is upside potential.
That's very encouraging from where we sit here. I'll talk about something discouraging for people in Alberta. Over the last several months, we've seen both Germany and Japan come to Canada and ask that they would love to buy more natural gas, LNG, from Canada. And largely, they've left empty-handed. Give us the take on how that's been viewed elsewhere in the world. And is Canada being viewed as an energy and perhaps even a food supplier that can be counted on in the next world?
Food supplier, absolutely. There's no reason to expect that will change. Energy supplier, you've never been considered an energy supplier to the world. You're an energy supplier to North America.
To the United States.
There's a difference, yes. And the questions that the Japanese and the Germans had, they were not coming to Canada because they thought it was going to be a slam dunk. They were coming to Canada because it's a Hail Mary. There are no places in the world that can easily step into Russia's shoes from the European or the Asian point of view. And honestly, I don't think the Germans or the Japanese were very hopeful when they arrived in the first place, because let's be honest, you are not a country, you are 10 provinces, which means for Albertan crude to get out, it has to either run
through British Columbia.
Oh my God, I mean, the BCers,
we're about to get a new pipeline there with the Trans Mountain expansion.
I would not hold your breath on that one, because just because the federal government has kind of given in to allow it to happen, the political coalition that is supporting the minority government is not in favor of that. Mm-hmm. And the federal government is unlikely to do anything, even when it's built, to make sure it can operate. So all of the protest groups, especially the BC government, which is one of the protest groups, are going to do everything they can to stymie that pipeline from the day it's finished. So I wouldn't count on that one. And then if you're going east, oh my God. It's like BC on steroids in order to get it off to the East Coast.
Right. And especially Quebec has said that they're very, very uninterested in any future pipelines.
And even then, if you can get the natural gas to the coast, you then have to build an LNG liquefaction facility. No one has ever built one of those in less than 5 years. So when Japan and Germany were like, they were kind of hoping against hope that something would happen, but it was hoping against hope. There is no way to fix their problems. with LNG in the midterm.
How will they fix their problems, or how can they fix their problems?
I'm not too concerned about Japan. So Japan, series of very rocky volcanic islands, and most of the urban centers are not physically connected. So each urban center has to have its own ground up energy infrastructure, and they know that if they rely on one commodity or fuel source, that if something happens with that market, they're screwed. So every single urban center has a coal burning power plant, an LNG burning power plant, a nuclear power plant, and sometimes some alternative stuff that even includes wood. And they don't need them all. They only need one or two of them to work.
To meet their power needs.
Exactly. And so they even have oil burning, which is only Lebanon burns oil anymore. So for them, it would have been nice to have another supplier, but they have other options and they don't need them all. And remember that because of their demographic situation and their deindustrialization, the Japanese don't use nearly as much energy as they used to. They used to take 5 million barrels a day. Now it's 3.25. So they have a lot of overbuilding in their power sector that gives them a lot of flexibility, and they can tap the Western Hemisphere in a way that the Germans really can't. The Germans, though, are fundamentally screwed.
Are we headed for deindustrialization in Germany? Is that what the road is?
When the Nord Stream pipeline went offline, they lost 40% of their natural gas supply. Even if they were to keep all of their nuclear plants online, that doesn't help them with the petrochemicals that undergird their entire industrial base. So there is no import system that allows them to run their industrial plant on the same price point that they become used to. They're looking at chronically now 7 times prices of what they used to have. And that's an end to Volkswagen. That's the end to the entire industrial model, and there is no way to replace that. They built their entire industry on the globalized post-war environment of access to Russian cheap energy and access to global markets to sell to. They have now aged out. They're aging into mass retirement, so they're losing their workforce. They've lost the energy now, and there's just no coherence to it at all. So we should expect that basically to go away over the next 2 years.
And because you brought it up, I want to talk about the Nord Stream pipeline. Security.
I don't know who blew it up. I just don't know.
You just don't know who blew it up. You don't have a theory, Dave?
Oh, I've got a theory, but I mean, the problem is that nobody's theories make sense for about 15 seconds. So theory number 1, the Russians did it, which means they blew up their own pipeline. Primary piece of leverage over Europe, especially over Germany. That's very, cutting off your nose to spite your face kind of thing.
Right.
The second theory is that the United States did it, but the United States had already won. Back on September 1, people forget that the Russians shut it off. And they told the Germans publicly, look, without this pipeline, your entire industrial base collapses and you deindustrialize. So we're going to make you choose publicly. You either side with us on Ukraine and you keep the gas flowing, you can remain modern, or you can remain Western and you can deindustrialize. They chose to deindustrialize. The Germans get a lot of crap for being foot dragging on this conflict. People forget that they had already sacrificed everything.
Right. Paying a huge cost.
Yeah. And so from the American point of view, we were like, oh, holy crap. We did not think the Germans were going to answer it that way.
Right.
Why would we blow up the pipeline after the Germans had already made that choice? So that doesn't hold. My personal theory, and I have nothing to support this. Just
Perfect. Yeah. Speculative theories.
Yeah, it's all of them are like this. All these theories are like this. So my theory is that, we know for sure that the order to turn off Gazprom didn't come from Gazprom. It came from the Kremlin. It was a political pressure tactic. Gazprom, according to the contracts that it has for supplies to the Germans, if they shut off the pipeline for any reason, then Gazprom is on the hook to compensate the Germans for replacement supplies at whatever price the Germans have to pay, which was 7 times what Gazprom was earning. So after a couple weeks of that, the Gazprom folks are looking at their budget like, holy crap, this is bad. So they blew up their own pipeline because then it's force majeure. It's just a theory. I think it holds up for about 15 seconds longer than the other theories, but still it's a reach.
But it gives you at least a theory that holds up a tiny bit longer than the other ones.
The Swedes, behind closed doors, are 100% certain that it was the Russians.
Really?
Yes, and they have been since the day it happened. They had assets in theater, they were listening, they've been down, they've swabbed, they've done all the tests, they've seen all the hardware, and they're maintaining firmly that this was the Russians the whole time. But if the Europeans publicly accuse with proof, then they cannot import anything from Russia any longer because the Russians would have been blowing up critical European infrastructure. And the whole idea of the sanctions regime is to give the Europeans time to adapt.
Right.
And so cutting it off in a day? No. Now, if we get to a point a year from now when the Russian stuff is gone from the European system, then the Swedes will probably come out, here's the proof. We're not there yet.
I want to talk about a different part of the energy system, electric vehicles. Because I've heard you talk about this, and I've watched people chase you out of the room to talk to you about it more. And you said something controversial to the end that electric vehicles might not be around all that much longer. That is the polar opposite of what we hear from every politician who says we're going to be selling nothing but electric vehicles in a few years. Why do you say what you do?
Sure. Well, let's start with the basis that a lithium-based electric vehicle absorbs a huge amount of energy in its creation. And most of the lithium processing, most of the aluminum processing, most of the silicon processing, and that's what's in the frames, is all done in China, and it's all done with soft coal. So the carbon footprint for these things is not being factored into most people's carbon assessments when you're determining where the break-even price is in terms of carbon. If you do that, there are any place in the world that runs on a mix that is more than 70% fossil fuel, which is the vast majority, you're talking at a break-even time that approaches a decade, if not more. And that's for light vehicles. You get into heavies, it extends it out considerably. Now, there aren't a lot of EV heavy vehicles, so take that for what it is. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, if you want to electrify transport in North America, you need to double the size of the grid. That would obviously be a challenge.
Double the size.
So what we've done in the last 150 years, double that in the next 7.
Right.
Okay.
Which, especially in a place like Canada, where it takes us a very long time to build any sort of major project.
Not just you. So both of these things are things that politically you can ignore if you want to, and you can throw enough money at it to make it happen. It doesn't make them impossible, just makes them perhaps not the best idea. But there is something out there that makes it impossible. If you want to double the size of the grid, if you want to electrify transport, and if you want to do it on a schedule that people say we want to achieve by 2030, that means we need 3 times as much copper, 4 times as much chromium, 4 times as much aluminum, 10 times as much nickel, 18 times as much graphite. Never in human history have we ever doubled our production of any industrial material in a 10-year period, ever. And we're going to do this for 14 materials now?
Simultaneously.
Right. And we're losing Russian output, and the Russians are a top 4 producer for about half of this stuff. And we're going to lose the processing capacity in China. So this cannot happen with today's technology. Just can't. The stuff isn't there. Does that mean we will walk away from it completely? Not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we're going to have to make choices about where we want to apply these materials and where we can get the biggest bang for our buck. Now, if this was done purely looking at economics and carbon, I would put wind turbines throughout the Great Plains, including in Alberta. I would put solar in the American Southwest, roughly from central Texas and the Austin-San Antonio corridor all the way to Los Angeles. Yep. And then I would spend most of the money and most of the resources that we have on transmission from those zones to the places that don't. And that would probably gobble up almost all of the material, or like our, quote, share of global materials. Now, the materials are not available globally. So we're going to be able to do more in the Western Hemisphere than the Eastern, but we also have better wind and solar frontage in the Western Hemisphere than the Eastern. But putting up solar panels, the only place in the world that it's dumber to put solar panels up than Toronto is Berlin. And so these are the 2 capitals that are pushing this the hardest. It's just absolutely asinine. One of the fun things that we're seeing in the green community right now is a conversation which is degrading into a debate, which is degrading into a knife fight between the Greens of California and the Greens of Germany, because the 2 of them have very similar policies when it comes to encouraging renewables. The Californians have spent 1/3 as much as the Germans and are getting 5 times the power because the sun doesn't shine in Germany.
Yes.
But it does in California.
Anybody who's been to either of those places would know that instantly.
Exactly. And no, this is a conversation they should have had 15 years ago. Basic geography and what it means for technology. They're having it now. It's overdue, but I'm glad they're having it. And if you start playing the results of that conversation against this materials shortage we're coming across, the Greens are going to be the ones at the lead of deciding where this works and where it doesn't. And that is absolutely the community we want making this decision. We're not there yet, but we are rapidly moving in the right direction. EVs don't make the cut. You would have to have a green system to manufacture them, and you would have to power them with green, and it would have to be in a society where everyone can charge their cars at the day, which means they're all working night shift.
Right.
I am unaware of a metro where that exists. So EVs just don't work in a constrained environment. So you focus on generation where generation does well, and then you use transmission to get it to the next tier of cities beyond that zone. That's still a really good start.
One of the other fistfights that I see happening in the green community is about nuclear. And, I'll put my bias on the table that I think nuclear has to be a huge part of the solution to any sort of a green future. And I sort of see society collectively sort of standing around sometimes saying, boy, we need to decarbonize. And if only we had this fuel source that was, emitted no carbon and was nearly unlimited, wouldn't that be great? Oh, well, dreams don't always come true. And then nuclear is sitting right there, but it's not the darling, at least of big chunks of the green movement. What do you see as the future for nuclear in this?
Well, let's start with the supply issue because it's relevant for nuclear too. The single largest supplier of uranium to the world is Kazakhstan. And most of that stuff is processed in either China or Russia. So we honestly can't, that's like 40% of global supply that is under a degree of threat right there. So while I certainly agree that nuclear should be part of the solution, we do have an absolute limit as to how big it can get, even before you consider the political obstacles.
Saskatchewan does have a lot of uranium too.
That is true, and Canada and Australia are the two countries that are expanding their output most quickly, but it's just the process for bringing uranium on doesn't just involve the mine, and then it's the milling, then it's the yellowcake, and then it's the hexafluoride processing and the spinning down. There's a lot of infrastructure steps before you get to fuel. So a really big investment program right now, you're talking minimum 10 years before you actually get the fuel and volume, and that doesn't count the time it takes to build the reactor. So it's a long-term solution if we're going to do it. And then in the United States, at least, we still don't have a fuel disposition program. We have Yucca Mountain, which is still not operational, which is already completely subscribed. And so everyone's basically leaving them in coolant ponds right on site, which is not, in my opinion, a very viable long-term solution. Now, other countries have come up with ways to make it work better. The technology is there, but it would require multiple acts of Congress to push that forward. And the Soviets, not the Russians, the Soviets were very successful in the 60s in encouraging anti-nuclear sentiment throughout the Western world. Honestly, that's where Greenpeace came from. And a lot of that lingers today. And then, of course, every once in a while you have a Chernobyl or a Fukushima, and that doesn't help.
Right. And they seem to occur with just metronomic regularity that just when society sort of becomes kind of accustomed to nuclear again, it just takes one scare,
it's probably going to take a new technology, of which there are two that are probably about ready for prototype stage. So one of them is called a pebble bed. It's a fourth generation nuclear facility. The French are probably the closest to building it. And the fuel's in pebbles in a bed of insulated material. So even if everyone shuts down all the safety protocols and leaves for the weekend, there's not enough uranium in each individual pellet to go into meltdown. So in theory, it's meltdown proof. In theory, you still have to build it. The second one are small modular reactors that you can fit in a container on the back of a truck. And the idea is you can pull that into a decommissioned coal power plant and just hook it up to the electricity system.
Right.
And all of a sudden, 3/4 of the cost of a normal reactor goes away. And based on the size of the power plant, you can put up to 9 of these into a single arrangement. The United States government just gave approval to the prototype design. And so they're now going to be building one of those over the next couple of years. So hopefully we'll find out within a couple of years whether it's viable and safe. But if it is, you still then have to go through the process of bringing it into mass manufacture.
Right.
And so you're really talking about 2030 before we get any appreciable movement in this in terms of actually affecting the grid.
Yeah, not a short-term solution, but small modular reactors are looked at here, or SMRs. You can walk the streets of Calgary and hear people talking about SMRs, are looked at with a lot of favorability.
It's promising. It's promising. But again, no one has built one yet. So let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Right. Although many say that American nuclear submarines have very similar
different technology. Very different technology. So the water-cooled reactors that are in subs are, if anything, very old technology.
Of course.
And if you're going to apply those in scale, you're talking about something that is far more proliferation prone than a conventional reactor. Keep in mind that because it's a military asset and it is by definition sequestered and under guard at all times, they don't use low enriched uranium in the subs. They use weapons grade uranium, and that's how it can be so small. You would not want a Bubba in North Dakota operating that.
Let's move to the war in Ukraine. For the longest time, we're a business and policy organization. For the longest time, business people cared about geopolitics, but only in sort of a peripheral way. They care about commodity prices and things like that. That has all changed within the last year. And virtually every conversation that I have now with CEOs begins with geopolitics, and it often begins with the war in Ukraine. So I'll just throw it wide open. Give me your assessment of where we're at in the war today and what we will likely see playing out between now and about June.
Sure. Well, let's start with the fact of why people are paying attention for the first time. It's for 75 years, the Americans maintained the globalized system. We told everyone for 75 years borders don't matter. And, when your entire business life of you and your parents are in that environment, you forget how the rest of the world works because you have been told by the superpower that you don't need to worry about it.
Right.
Now we have to worry about it.
Just-in-time inventory, global supply chains.
Exactly. Everything about the system that we understand right now of efficiency and interconnection is based on everything working and everything being safe, and that world is now over. So yes, now we have to pay attention. For Ukraine, this is a classic Athens, Sparta, David, Goliath fight. So the Ukrainians are massively outnumbered, even with all the equipment they've gotten from NATO. And the Russians are now rousing themselves. They started the war with 100,000 troops in Ukraine, and they are now in the midst of their second mobilization, and by the time we get to May, they will have over 700,000 in theater. The Ukrainians don't have any more men. So just the scale of which, just the size of the challenge the Ukrainians face is huge. The Ukrainians cannot win a war of attrition, and in a battle where they inflict 3-to-1 casualties on the Russians,
They'll still lose.
They'll still lose. And they'll lose badly because that assumes that the 3 Russians die and the 1 Ukrainian heals and can live to fight another day. It's just not enough. You need to get it up to a minimum of 8-to-1. 10-to-1 would be better. The only way you do that is with speed and mobility. Whether it's battle tanks, artillery, deep strike, whatever it happens to be, the Ukrainians have to be able to outmaneuver the Russians, cut off their logistical supplies, encircle them, and kill them in mass. That is the only way that Ukraine wins this war. And they had hoped to be able to start that this winter. But this winter is the freakishly warm. It is 30 degrees. Well, sorry, Canada. It is 20 degrees.
Yeah, 15.
No, 20. It's 20 degrees above norm. And so the ground has never frozen in Ukraine. And instead of being able to run tanks and artillery through the fields that are frozen and hit the Russians wherever they feel they need to, they have been stuck in fixed place defense against human wave assaults. And yes, they're killing Russians by the tens of thousands, but it's not enough and it's not fast enough. And by the time we get to May, when the ground dries out enough that they will be able to do that, there are going to be so many more Russians in theater. And the Russians are probably going to push on at least 3 different axes in order to break Ukraine up and make the movement option impossible. So when we get to May and the Russians launch these assaults, the more mobile, smaller Ukrainian forces are going to have to choose very carefully where to stand and fight to try to blunt those assaults and where to try to get behind them and break them up. It's not a fair fight. By the numbers, Russia should win. That doesn't mean that they will, because the Russians have been going out of their way to try to fail at every opportunity so far.
And there have been other times in this conflict where, on paper, one would have assumed that the Russians would have won by now.
The Ukrainians are absolutely punching well above their weight, and that's before you consider that by May we will have 60,000 Ukrainian forces who have been training with NATO for the last few months coming in with better equipment. So it really is an Athens-Sparta kind of fight. It's still the Russians to lose. If the Ukrainians are going to survive, they need to kill at least 100,000 Russians before mid-July, minimum. That doesn't allow them to win. That allows them to survive. That's the minimum that they will have to kill just to hold the line.
So if there's this break point coming in May, June, and July of this year, what are the potential scenarios for how this plays out?
Well, scenario 1 is they're able to blunt the assault, but they certainly can't push them back, in which case we just continue with, we go until either Russia runs out of men or the Ukrainians run out of equipment. That's a slugging match that could very well take a couple of years. Scenario 2 is the Russians do break the Ukrainians and they're at the Polish border this year, in which case we will get that direct NATO-Russia conflict that we've been desperately trying to avoid this whole time. Because from the Russian point of view, capturing all of Ukraine does not solve their security problem. They actually have to plug the access points that allow access to the Eurasian landmass, and that means getting to Warsaw. And that means a direct fight with NATO.
And is that the nightmare scenario?
Yeah, because that means there will be nukes used. The Russians have proved repeatedly that they can't find a conventional war against NATO equipment in the traditional sense. And if we get them attacking NATO and you get the full force of NATO and the American military complete with total air superiority, it'll obliterate the conventional columns, and the only thing that the Russians will have left to throw are nukes, and they will throw them.
So that's scenario 2.
That's scenario 2. Scenario 3, the Ukrainians are able to do a lightning assault south, probably from Zaporizhzhia to the Sea of Azov, and in doing so completely cut off the entirety of the Crimea. Crimea relies on irrigation from a single canal for 80% of their food production, and the sluice gate is now in Ukrainian control, so it will not be turned on. And with the Kerch Strait Bridge offline, the Russians can't rail food into Crimea, and the rest of the Kerch Bridge, the road bridge, is undoubtedly going to go down later this year. So there you put the bulk of the best troops that the Russians have on a starvation diet, literally, and you probably have 500,000 people dying from famine in the Crimea, including the best of the Russian military units this year. I don't think even in the best case scenario that the Ukrainians can kick the Russians out of the eastern parts of Ukraine this year, because they don't have sufficient deep strike into Russia proper to break up the logistics lines. And that is what is necessary. If Ukraine is going to win, they don't just need to clear their own territory. They need to clear the ability of the Russians to invade in the first place. And that means striking deep, at least 300 kilometers over
Good
the
conversions.
border. I was raised metric, so it's weird living in the United States and thinking metric. So anyway, we're not ready for that fight, but that fight is not this year.
Right. So there's several scenarios there that you've painted, and most of them aren't that rosy.
Welcome to war in the Eurasian horde lands.
So if you're advising the NATO coalition,
Which, to be clear, I am not.
Yes, okay, to be clear, you are not. But if you were, if you were standing in front of the assembled leaders of NATO, they said, Peter, what's your advice given these scenarios that you see playing out? What would you tell them?
If you don't want to get nuked, you need to give Ukraine absolutely everything they can get as soon as they possibly can. Western troops can't be on the ground. That would trigger a nuclear exchange in no time. But the pace of training needs to expand by at least an order of magnitude, and that means we need to double, probably quadruple, the rate of arms manufacture across the NATO alliance as soon as possible.
Let's go to the other area of the world that everyone always wants to talk about, China. China's been a huge story for a couple of decades. In explosive economic growth, another global pole of power. You're not very hot on China's future. Why is that?
No. This is a country that imports 75% of its energy, 80% of which comes from the Persian Gulf. This is a country that is the world's largest food importer. This is a country that imports 80% of the components and the inputs that are necessary to maintain its own food production. And its food production, once you look at the cost of the materials that go in, is the lowest in the world in terms of efficiency per hectare. This is a country that is basically Enron in nation-state form in terms of its finance. And its leader has completely decapitated the decision-making process of every province and every bureau in the entire system. It is waiting to fall. On top of that, it is dying. They're now admitting that they overcounted their population by over 100 million people since one child, suggesting that all of the missing millions are age 40 or under, childbearing. Mm-hmm. And even before that, they already had the fastest aging workforce in human history. China will cease to exist as a functional, economically viable population by the end of this decade, assuming there's no food or energy or finance or political or trade or security crisis, all of which are on deck.
Right. So, yeah, you've laid out, there's a number of breakpoints, any one of which, or two of which.
Any of them is a country and a regime killer, but all of them? God.
So help me understand how you would view two countries that I think are very interesting to compare, which is China and India. Comparably sized populations, at least in official statistics, although you've talked about the 100 million potential overcount. For the last couple of decades, though, China has won the economic competition between these. The economy is more than 5 times larger than India, despite the fact that India has a comparable population and typically better education even than China does. What's the next 2 decades going to look like for these two countries?
So I expect Chinese disintegration over the next decade. And then the decade after that, if we're lucky, it will not devolve into a civil war, but that's a very reasonable possibility. But a severe breakup and a severe population correction, if you want to use a sterile term for 500 million people dying of famine, is kind of baked in at this point. So China reverts from being a country to a geographic concept like it has been for most of its history. India won't have an energy crisis. It's the first stop out of the Persian Gulf. It might have a food crisis, but they have fertilizer fabrication in country, and they don't have the security issue for bringing in things like phosphate or potash that the Chinese have. So if it can be solved, it will be solved in India. Their security crisis is one they're familiar with Pakistan, Bangladesh. We'll never rule out that they will start duking it out again, and since nukes are part of the equation, we can't ignore that. But neither side is like itching for that fight, and they actually do have decent buffers between Pakistan and India. There's a desert for most of it. So I don't think that's likely. You remove the Germans and the Chinese from global manufacturing, and North America has to double the size of its industrial plant if it still wants stuff. India has to do the same thing. Now, unlike the US and Canada, India doesn't have a partner. They don't have the equivalent of a Mexico to help out and make this an easier carry. So it's not going to be as efficient. It's not going to be as high quality, but it's going to be enough for them. And if you are producing goods for 1.5 billion people,
that's a consumer base.
That's a lot of economic growth. And yes, the consumer base, their demographics are not aging nearly as quickly as China's. They are aging. It is not the bottomless pit of people that people think it is. If you
think median age somewhere around 27 or 28.
I don't have that number at top of mind. But if you think of a traditional demographic structure as a pyramid with more babies than children, than young adults, than mature adults, than retirees, just a pyramid. India, the pyramid goes down to about age 35 and then drops straight down. So they are aging quickly. And that will be a problem 40 years from now.
Right.
But that's 40 years. A lot can change in 40 years.
So before we go back to North America, one other tour around the world, because we've talked about demographics. One area of the world where demographics can look quite favorable is in Africa. And for a long time, people have pointed to Africa as, maybe the next place that's going to ascend. I've even seen your chart of Nigeria has, I think, some of the best looking demographics that you can imagine. What do you see playing out there? Are they going to be able to take advantage of this demographic dividend?
The short version is probably not. I mean, Africa is a big place, 50 odd countries. The story I'm about to tell you doesn't match for all of them, but for most of them. So the African demographic profile has happened because of two things. Number one, the world is sufficiently globalized, and China has been sufficiently hungry that they will pay anything for raw materials, that all of Africa, not just sub-Saharan Africa, has been able to export raw commodities that are industrial and import food. And that has allowed the populations to expand significantly. So Egypt today, if all of a sudden food imports were no longer an option, they would lose half their population. Even if they converted all their citrus and all of their cotton to wheat, they now have twice the population that's necessary, or double the population that their land could support if they just switched over to wheat. And no one in Africa is that extreme, but they're all kind of flavors of that trend. Number two, part of the reason that countries, as they industrialize for the early decades, actually get a much larger population is child mortality goes down significantly. In the case of Africa, that's not because they have gotten better at it. That's because they've been able to afford the technologies that they import in terms of things like antibiotics and child care stuff. In a post-globalized environment, the food imports and those technologies go away. And you would expect to see population crashes. Maybe not as dramatic as what I'm expecting to see in China, but still horrific. The second problem is that Africa is a series of 5 stacked plateaus, and it's very difficult to get physical infrastructure up and down those plateaus. So in the colonial era, the Europeans never tried. They built tap lines to go to a specific economic resource, typically a mine, and that was it. And the Africans have discovered that the cost of building a real transport network is just too onerous, and the benefits from it are too thin. So it just really hasn't happened at scale outside of South Africa. That makes it very hard for them to benefit in a post-globalized system. They'll still have those tap lines. They'll still have the resources that the world needs. And I don't think we're going to have a
raw commodities, though.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to have a new colonial era because, just because they're going to see higher expenses and higher death rates doesn't mean that all of a sudden all the guns are going to go away. I mean, part of the reasons why the colonial era was so horrible for the Africans is the Europeans brought guns to knife fights for decades. Well, Africans' guns might not be as good as European guns, but they're still guns. And so that the delta isn't there anymore. But that doesn't mean I think they're going to do great. So there's pockets. Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, Nigeria, Senegal, where the infrastructure is easier to build. I think they'll do better. But then you get your third thing, and that's HIV. The birth rates, the survivability of the youth in Africa in the HIV countries has basically dropped by more than half. And yes, they are now getting better at prevention, but that takes a massive melon scoop out of their demographic structure that is irreplaceable.
So we've done a little tour around many parts of the world, and you've succeeded in depressing me on many of them.
You're welcome.
I know that there are, and I know that that's not true of everyone. Let's go back to North America, because you're much more positive on North America and the United States in particular as a place that can provide most of what it needs, and the few things that it can't provide itself generally come from Canada, and the manufacturing capacity that it might need can come from Mexico. How positive are you on America's future?
Well, let's start with the basics that most countries kind of lack. The United States and Canada are two of the world's greatest agricultural producers and massive exporters. Check, that's not going anywhere. The North American system can provide for its own input system for agriculture, so it's not going to go anywhere at all. Canada and the United States are two of the world's largest energy producers and processors. Yeah. That's not going anywhere. So already the basics of civilization look pretty good. We've got ocean moats. We don't have to worry about an invasion. Check. Our demographics. The United States is the healthiest demography in the advanced industrial world. Mexico is the healthiest demography in its peer class. Mm-hmm. And Canada has the best record in the world, bar none, for attracting people in their 20s and 30s via immigration. Mm-hmm. Those three together make North America by far the best demographic picture on the planet. So our capital structure is more or less stable. Our consumption base is fine. Our weakness is in manufacturing. Mm-hmm. Now, because of the shale revolution, the United States is very good at low-end manufacturing. Heavy chemicals, plastics, that sort of thing, because we have the cheapest inputs in the world.
Right.
We're also, because of our educational system, the best at the high end. That's where Canada competes, and not well. In the middle are the Mexicans.
Right.
Everything from heavy machinery to automotive, they excel. So the challenge moving forward is the other stuff, the stuff that we've largely farmed out to East Asia. On the low end, the materials processing, that's primarily a China story. I'm really not worried about the long-term picture, because we're talking about, when you want to turn lithium into metal or bauxite into aluminum, this is 1920s technology. This is not hard. It's not even very expensive. You just have to take the time to build and site the industrial plant, and you don't do that overnight. So it's probably going to take a shortage to force us to do it, but it would already be far more cost-effective to do it on the U.S. Gulf Coast than it is in China. Mm-hmm. So I'm not too worried there. I'm worried about electronics.
Right.
Electronics, computing, cell phones, that sort of thing. The thing with electronics is there are so many pieces of different quality sets that require different labor forces, some of which earn $1 a day, some of which earn $1 a second, in close proximity. So in North America, particularly on the Texas-Mexican border, your average car, the pieces are crossing 5 and 6 times before you get your finished vehicle. That's an industry where we found a way to make it work. Electronics is a lot more complicated than automotive. And the disconnect, the delta between the low end and the high end labor required is much bigger.
Right.
And so you need the Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand. You need all of them to do it at scale. That's going away. The only place in North America where we even theoretically could do that is the U.S.-Mexico border region. And maybe if we loop in Colombia for the really low-end stuff. It's not a natural fit like Southeast Asia is. And so that is going to be the biggest adjustment for us, is how to build electronics at scale without that sort of differentiated labor system. And I do not see many opportunities for Canada to play in that space at all, because the Canadian border is with the United States, which is a similar labor structure.
Right. We don't have those competitive advantages of any kind. Let's talk about Canada-U.S. For a moment here. One of the most successful relationships, I would say maybe the most successful relationship between any two countries anywhere. But there's something that Canadians notice about every American president, regardless of stripe, which is Buy American, protectionism.
Sure.
And every successive president seems to try and double down on Buy American a little bit more than the one before them, including President Biden very recently sort of supercharging a little bit more Buy American. Is there a way through that for Canada? No.
Honestly, the hard work is done. So, and the person you have to think about this is Donald Trump. which I know I can see you breaking out into hives already. One of the many clauses about NAFTA 2. I mean, let me start. I am not a fan of Trump in any way, shape, or form, but I thought NAFTA 2, the way it was done, how it was done, when it was done, was beautifully done. I realized that
It's
there are a lot of
largely
people
viewed very positively in the business community of Canada, too.
I mean, you guys lost a lot of your perks from NAFTA 1, and let's be honest, it was time. But part of it is that the rules of origin laws, especially when it comes to things like automotive, are pretty strict. And that's really, really bad for any automaker in the world who is not in NAFTA. You are. Now, I think the best way that Canada can leverage this is in processing, and this is specifically Alberta. You've got the land, you've got the green space, and especially in Alberta, you've got the cheap electricity and the cheap energy. And that is the big hole that we have in the midterm. Now, the Gulf Coast is going to do everything they can to dominate this, but there's plenty of room for materials processing in Alberta, and I think you really need to take advantage of that. Beyond that, if you want to go into manufacturing, I'm not sure automotive is the greatest place for you to compete overall because you don't have proximate centers to synergize with. But the more advanced components, the ones that are very high value added, the ones where transport is a minuscule, if not a rounding error to zero, part of the value, basically if the part can be flown to its assembly location in an economically viable manner, that's where you can play. I'm not sure you can do that in automotives or EVs, but I bet you can do that in aerospace and electronics.
Great point. So as we think about the sort of the Canada-U.S. relationship going forward, one of the other questions I have is Canada's sort of role in the world, our geopolitical role in the world. That, I'm not sure that for the last decade or more that Canada has had a particularly high profile globally. But we have a lot of building blocks, many of which you've just described, a significant global energy producer, a significant global fertilizer producer, a significant global food producer. Do you think that there's a role that Canada could play as sort of a middle power in the world to come?
Oh, you're going to hate me because the answer is a flat no. There was a joke that went around American political circles in the 90s that with the end of the Cold War, New Zealand joined the non-aligned movement and Canada just became an NGO.
I haven't heard that one, but I understand it.
Even if Canada could function as a normal, unified, federal or unitary system, and it can't, even if it could, the shape of Canada, the size of Canada, the fact that it has an Atlantic and a Pacific frontage that are so separated economically, strategically, and culturally, you couldn't play. Because if you can't provide the base security, none of the rest of it works. Now, post-World War II, pre-Ukraine Canadian policy piggybacked on global safety to push development goals and economic development and trade access. And in that, you were a middle power. But it was because of an environment that you could not create or shape. That environment is now gone. And so you would have to create or shape it yourself. You don't have the capacity. You're too far away, you're too split, you're too small. I'd argue the United States doesn't have that capacity to do it at scale on a global basis.
Wow.
We are going to have to choose. Now, the fact that Japan has decided to fuse with American power is a huge step in helping that work in different areas. But I think
Especially
Southeast
naval
Asia,
power. Yeah.
I think Southeast Asia, Northern Europe, specifically Scandinavia, again in partnership with the Brits, and maybe a degree of the Western Hemisphere in general, I think that's what we are going to be limited to. So within that pond, Canada can do a lot. But in addition to making friends with Washington, I would make friends with Tokyo, because if you're looking for something that's a little bit not the United States,
Right.
That's really the only option on deck until such time as the Brits kind of finally figure out what Brexit means.
So over and above that, making friends with Tokyo, I'll ask you another advice question. If you're advising the Prime Minister of Canada, if you don't think we can play as a middle power, how do you think we should play?
This, again, is not going to be a very friendly answer. Every Canadian province trades more with the United States than it does with the rest of the world. That will not change this century. I realize that the primary Canadian cultural identifier is that we're not American. I get it. I understand it.
Even though like 80% of us live, within a
within
2-hour
sight
drive.
of the border. Yeah. I would say that the best way, if the goal is to maintain a little bit of light between the United States and Canada, and I understand why that is, the only place you can play is finance. Your energy goes south, your food processing largely goes through American ports. There's really not another player here, and your trade is dependent on American security. But there's a lot of money that's really scared from the rest of the world that is looking for a place to call home. And until recently, all of it that comes to Canada has been going into housing, and you need to redirect that somewhere else.
Right.
So
huge housing affordability issues
exactly.
in Canada at the moment. Yeah.
Now,
particularly in our gateway cities. Yeah.
the foreigners who are doing this, they're scared they're going to lose everything, and it's a reasonable fear. And they would prefer a hard asset, a rate of return, and an implicit government guarantee, and housing checks 2 of the 3 boxes. So your goal is to create a financial product that checks 3 boxes, called a community development bond. We're moving into an environment where capital is going to be harder to get. And if you can find a way to funnel stupid, scared capital into more productive uses, that will make Canada awash with foreign money that doesn't really care what its rate of return is. Because if they get half of it back after 10 years, that means they got half their money out. They call that a win.
Better than zero.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you can get the foreigners to pay for your own system, that's the way forward here. And that is the big outsized win for Canada to become, I don't want to call them money launderers to the stars or anything like that.
No, I don't think that should be the tagline.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But you could put it to more productive use than it can if it just goes into housing.
Well, that brings me to the last thing I have time to ask you today, which is about inflation. Because, if we were to survey, in fact, we regularly do, the folks that live in Alberta and Calgary and Canada, I can tell you what's coming up at the top of their concern list. It's affordability, particularly inflation, and how interest rates interact with that as well. Now, there's this feeling of hopefulness that perhaps the period of inflation is mostly behind us, the pain is mostly behind us, and the interest rates will start to come down relatively rapidly. Do you share that view?
No. In the United States, we're not going to see rates come down for another decade. We have to wait for another generation to become capital rich. Those will be the millennials. Basically, what's happening in the United States is the boomers are retiring. They're taking all their money with them. And even if interest rates were able to come down, capital costs really wouldn't. We have to wait for more people to enter their 50s. That means 2030 to 2035 is when we see the break. Canada's inflation is coming from 2 sources. Number one is the property market. There's no reason to expect that to get better except for this ban on foreign purchases. The foreigners are going to find more and more creative ways to get around that. And so the policy will have to continually be updated to keep that under control. But the second reason you've been dealing with inflationary issues is COVID. From the point that a demand profile shifts, whether it's because of a lockdown or a new vaccine makes it possible to open, or the anti-vaxxers throw a fit, or the anti-vaxxers all get put in prison, whatever it happens to be. It takes about 18 months for the supply chains to match the new demand profile. And in the United States and Canada, it was 18 months ago that we started our opening. So we're finally getting to the end of the COVID impact. And so yes, you're seeing disinflation now as the supply chains are finally repaired. What I see coming is disruptions that are far more serious, not in demand, but in supply.
Right.
Materials out of Russia, energy out of Russia, finished goods out of China. All of this is going to hit us over the next few years.
And typically supply-driven inflation is way harder to
Much
address.
harder to fix because you have to build fundamentally new industrial plant in different locations, or rebuild them from the ground up. Now, we will do that in North America. We will double the size of the industrial plant, but it will take us 5 years. And in that 5-year period, we will have inflation of 9 to 15% per annum. But it's not because we don't have stuff. It's because we're building the ability to have stuff. And it will be rampant economic growth to be paired with that inflation. So it'll hurt, but at the end of it, we will have a supply chain system that is simpler, cleaner, more energy efficient, that employs people on the continent to sell people to the continent, that is immune to things that happen beyond the continent. This is a good story, but it's not a straight line, and it is bumpy.
There'll be some pain as we're running through the fence, but when we get to the other side, you paint actually a fairly positive picture. Well, and I think that's a good note to end it on, a note of positivity that in the long run, we'll be headed for a stronger, greener, cleaner, more secure economy. So thanks a lot, Peter. Really appreciate you being generous with your time today.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening. and we'll see you next time.